The cold marble of the High Council chamber bit into Lady Aurelia Thorne's bare knees, but she absolutely refused to shiver. Her spine remained as straight as a forged blade, her chin tilted upward toward the vaulted ceiling, where 1,000 beeswax candles in golden chandeliers cast a harsh, unforgiving light. The corset tightened mercilessly around her ribs, with every shallow breath she drew, trapping the stale air in her lungs, but her pride burned far hotter than the public humiliation they sought to inflict upon her. She was wearing a heavy dress of midnight blue velvet, entirely stripped of its traditional silver embroidery. It was a visual, undeniable declaration of her newly ruined status. Around her, the silken skirts of the southern high nobility rustled like a nest of disturbed vipers as the court eagerly watched her final disgrace. The echoing footsteps of her uncle, Lord Malachi Thorne, sounded like heavy hammer strikes against an iron anvil in the vast, silent hall. He stood deliberately before the empty southern throne holding the ancestral seal of House Thorne, a heavy, ancient crest of intertwined ravens forged in pure silver. Only moments ago he had violently torn it from her neck in front of the entire assembly. Malachi's voice dripped with a perfectly rehearsed false sorrow as he turned to address the gathering of greedy lords and whispering ladies. The late Earl of Thorne, my unfortunate brother, left us nothing but treasonous debts and a deeply stained name, Malachi proclaimed, ensuring his booming voice reached the heavy oak doors at the very back of the chamber. He conspired against the crown's economy, funneling gold to unknown mercenaries, to save what little honor remains of our fractured bloodline, and to repay the crown what was stolen. Lady Aurelia will be formally stripped of her titles. She is to be wed by nightfall to Baron Silas, a match highly suitable for her diminished standing. Aurelia's fingers tightened instinctively around a faded royal token, hidden deep within the dark folds of her velvet skirt. A singular silver coin given to her late father by the former sovereign, Baron Silas was not merely a minor lord of the outer provinces. He was a corrupt, decaying brute of a man infamous for bearing 3 young wives under the dark, frozen soil of the borderlands. This was not a marriage arrangement. It was a silent execution neatly disguised as a political alliance. Her heart hammered against her ribcage, not for herself, but for her younger sister, Cecily. If Aurelia fell today and accepted this doom, Cecily, a fragile girl of 16, would be sold to the highest bidder tomorrow to fund Malachi's insatiable thirst for power. Aurelia swallowed the dry lump of panic in her throat, preparing to stand and scream her defiance, even if it meant being dragged to the dungeons. Then an impossible irregularity occurred. The atmosphere in the massive chamber shifted violently. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall did not merely open, they were shoved violently apart with a massive force that made the ancient iron hinges scream in protest. The whispering court instantly went dead silent. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees in a matter of seconds, stealing the breath from the lungs of the southern aristocrats. Footsteps agonizingly slow, heavy, and perfectly rhythmic echoed over the gleaming marble. King Alistair Vane, the Iron Sovereign of the Winter Kingdom, had arrived in the south. He was a man seemingly carved from frost iron and war. At 32, he possessed a gaze so dark and calculating, it was whispered he could strip the flesh from a traitor's bones just by looking at them. He wore a heavy, black, military-wide greatcoat, draped casually over impossibly broad shoulders, entirely untouched by the golden frivolity and delicate silks of the southern court. He did not bother to look at the hastily bowing nobles, who parted like a frightened sea before him. He did not even glance at Lord Malachi, his eyes cold, absolute, and predatory, locked directly onto Aurelia, kneeling on the marble floor. Alistair stopped right at the edge of the royal dais. The Northern King rarely, if ever, attended civil disputes in the Southern Territories. His sudden presence here was a massive anomaly that sent visible ripples of absolute panic through Malachi's carefully maintained composure. "Your Grace," Malachi stammered, executing a hasty, profoundly ungraceful bow that made him look like a crumbling fool. "We are deeply honored. We are merely concluding a minor family matter. The girl is ruined, you see. She is being sent away to settle her father's unfortunate ledgers." "Ruined?" Alistair repeated. His voice was a low, rumbling baritone that commanded absolute, unquestioning obedience without a fraction of effort. It vibrated through the floorboards. "Is that so?" He stepped closer to Aurelia. He towered over her, a massive shadow completely swallowing the harsh light of the chandeliers above. The sharp, clean scent of winter frost, dark pine, and freshly polished steel washed over her, grounding her racing mind. "Get up," the king commanded softly. It was not a request. Aurelia slowly rose to her feet, her legs trembling slightly from the biting cold of the stone, but her posture flawlessly, defiantly regal. She looked the most dangerous man in the entire realm, dead in the eye, refusing to look down. She knew his terrifying reputation well. They called him the Monster of the North, a ruthless ruler who had drowned an entire southern rebellion in blood 3 years ago to avenge the assassination of his younger brother. "I understand your uncle is finalizing the paperwork for your transfer of ownership to Baron Silas tonight." Alistair said, his voice entirely devoid of pity or warmth. "I find that arrangement unacceptable. I am in need of a queen to secure my southern political borders before the winter solstice. I require a woman who understands the brutal weight of survival, not some delicate weeping flower who will wilt at the first sign of snow." The entire court erupted in a chorus of muffled gasps. Lord Malachi turned the sickly color of wet ash. "Your Grace, you cannot possibly be serious," Malachi choked out, stepping forward in sheer disbelief. "She has absolutely nothing. Her father betrayed the crown. She is penniless and disgraced." Alistair did not even blink at the older man. He merely tilted his head. "Her father's alleged crimes are entirely irrelevant to my requirements." He leaned slightly closer to Aurelia, lowering his voice so only she could hear the absolute finality in it. "I will clear your family's debts to the Southern Crown in their entirety. I will secure your sister's permanent safety behind the walls of my impenetrable northern fortress. In exchange, you will wear my crown. You will ask no questions regarding my wars. You will require no emotional affection, and you will present a perfect, unbreakable facade to my enemies. Do we have an understanding?" Aurelia stared at his sharp cheekbones and the terrifying bottomless emptiness in his dark eyes. He was offering her family salvation, yes, but it was wrapped tightly in a cage of solid ice. He viewed her desperation not with an ounce of pity, but as a highly convenient leverage point. He was using her family's absolute ruin as a mere bargaining chip for his own territorial control. The sheer audacity of his cold transactional proposition ignited a fierce, burning rage within her chest. The paralyzing fear that usually governed her interactions with the purveyors of power evaporated from her veins, replaced by a searing, elegant contempt. She stepped an inch closer to the king, completely ignoring the scandalous proximity and the collective gasp of the room. She did not raise her voice, but her tone was laced with absolute glacial fury. She expected immediate wrath. She expected the legendary explosive temper of the Iron Sovereign to shatter her, completely condemning her to the executioner's block before the night was over. The court behind her stopped breathing entirely. No one spoke to King Alistair Yvain that way and lived to see the dawn. Malachi took a panicked step back, distancing himself from the impending slaughter. Alistair Yvain stared down at her, his jaw locked tightly behind his royal calm. The mask of icy indifference slipped just a fraction. For a long, breathless moment, he was utterly silent. Then incredibly the king smiled. It was not a cruel smile, nor was it a mocking one. It was a genuine, startlingly bright expression of profound, dark amusement. The sight of it completely transformed his hardened face, briefly stripping away the monster and revealing a shockingly vibrant, dangerous man underneath. "Fascinating?" Alistair murmured, his voice dropping an octave, completely unbothered by her venomous strike. He offered her a slow, deliberate, mocking bow. "I look forward to our wedding, Lady Aurelia. Ensure your sister is packed." He turned his back on her, his heavy, dark cape sweeping aggressively over the marble floor. "Lord Malachi," Alistair called out over his broad shoulder, his tone returning instantly to a lethal, terrifying calm that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "If the girl, or her sister, are harmed, spoken down to, or touched in any manner before my royal carriage arrives at dawn, I will personally burn this estate to the ground and mount your head on the palace gates." Dawn broke over the southern estates, not with a gentle warmth, but with a brittle grey light that made the ancient stone walls of the Thorne Manor look like a decaying tomb. At the base of the grand marble steps, the royal carriage of the Winter Kingdom waited. It was a terrifyingly magnificent construct a literal fortress on heavy iron wheels built of dark polished oak and reinforced with steel plating. The royal crest of the Northern Crown, a striking silver wolf wreathed in frost, was emblazoned on the doors. It stood in stark, humiliating contrast to the meagre, unadorned wooden chest that held the entirety of Lady Aurelia's remaining worldly possessions. Lord Malachi stood on the terrace, flanked by silent, nervous guards. He wore a thick fur cloak, though the southern morning was merely brisk. He did not step forward to offer a farewell. He simply watched a cowardly man basking in the relief of a dodged execution, eager to see the niece he had ruined finally removed from his sight. Aurelia refused to give him the satisfaction of a backward glance. Her spine remained impossibly straight, her chin elevated with the absolute dignity of a queen, ascending to a throne rather than a disgraced exile being hauled away as payment. She held her 16-year-old sister Cecily tightly by the hand, guiding the trembling girl into the cavernous velvet-lined interior of the carriage. As Aurelia settled onto the plush leather seat, the massive carriage shifted under a heavy, sudden weight. The door swung open, and King Alistair Vane stepped inside. The suffocating expanse of the carriage instantly felt too small. He took the seat opposite the two sisters, his broad shoulders easily dominating the space. He still wore his dark military greatcoat, smelling of crisp winter air, oiled leather, and the faint metallic scent of a drawn blade. He did not speak as the footman slammed the heavy door shut, sealing them inside. A moment later, the crack of a whip sounded, and the carriage lurched forward, surrounded by the rhythmic thunder of 100 heavily armored northern cavalrymen escorting their king back to the frost. For the first 2 hours of the journey, the silence was absolute and agonizing. The temperature dropped steadily as the carriage climbed higher, in elevation leaving the rolling green hills of the south for the jagged, pine-covered mountains that bordered the Winter Kingdom. Cecily huddled deep into the corner, clutching a meager woolen shawl around her thin shoulders, her teeth chattering faintly. Aurelia, still wearing the midnight blue velvet dress from the night of her public disgrace, felt the biting chill seeping straight through her bones. Yet, she refused to rub her arms or show a single ounce of physical weakness. She sat perfectly still, her hands neatly folded in her lap, her breathing controlled. Alistair watched her from the shadows of his side of the carriage. His dark eyes were unnervingly still, missing absolutely nothing. Without a word, the king unclasped the heavy, massive cloak of black wolf fur draped around his shoulders. He leaned forward, the sudden movement causing Cecily to flinch, and tossed the enormous garment directly onto Aurelia's lap. The sheer weight of it was grounding, radiating an intense, lingering body heat. "Pride will not keep your blood flowing, Lady Aurelia." Alistair said, his voice a low, gravelly command that cut cleanly through the rumbling of the carriage wheels. "Wrap the girl in it before she freezes to death. I have no use for a corpse, and neither do you." Aurelia's jaw tightened. She wanted to reject the offering to throw the heavy fur back at his boots, but she looked at her shivering sister. Swallowing her bitter pride, she unfolded the massive cloak, wrapping it securely around Cecily's trembling frame. The girl let out a soft sigh of relief, instantly burying her face in the thick fur. Aurelia sat back up her own shoulders, still exposed to the biting cold, and finally met the king's dangerous gaze. "Why did you truly claim me?" she demanded, her voice kept purposefully low so as not to distress her sister further. "Do not insult my intelligence with tales of securing your political borders. A dozen southern houses would have eagerly offered you daughters, with untouched dowries and powerful military alliances. I am a cast-out orphan with a traitor's name. I bring you nothing but shame." Alistair leaned back against the dark leather cushions, crossing his arms over his broad chest. A flicker of genuine respect danced in his terrifying eyes. "You bring me exactly what I require," Alistair stated coldly. "A weapon." He reached into the inner pocket of his greatcoat and withdrew a folded piece of heavy, cream-colored parchment. He tossed it onto the empty space of the seat next to Aurelia. "Open it," he commanded. Aurelia hesitated, her heart giving a violent, irregular beat. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the sudden, suffocating tension filling the carriage. She picked up the parchment and carefully broke the wax seal. As she unfolded it, her eyes scanned the meticulously written lines of ink. It was a financial ledger, a a record of a massive transfer of royal gold to an organization known as the Crimson Company. At the bottom of the page rested the undeniable heavy wax seal of House Thorne, her father's seal. This is the document your uncle, Lord Malachi, presented to the Southern High Council, Alistair said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It was the proof used to declare your father a traitor. It claims the late Earl of Thorne was secretly financing a ruthless band of foreign mercenaries to destabilize the Crown's borders. Aurelia felt the air leave her lungs. My father was an honorable man, she whispered fiercely, the paper shaking in her grip. He despised the Crimson Company. He spent his final years demanding the Crown hunt them down for raiding the merchant routes. He would never fund them. I am entirely aware of that, Alistair replied softly. The sheer calm in his voice made Aurelia look up, her eyes wide with shock. Alistair leaned forward, the shadows catching the sharp, brutal angles of his face. 3 years ago, the Crimson Company ambushed a royal carriage traveling through the neutral territories. They slaughtered my personal guard and murdered my younger brother, Prince Edward. I have spent every waking moment since that day hunting the men who paid for that assassination. The Crimson Company does not act on its own. They are dogs who bite only when a master drops coin. He pointed a gloved finger at the parchment in her hand. Look closely at the signature beside your father's seal, Lady Aurelia. Look at the strokes of the ink. Aurelia forced her eyes to focus on the intricate loops of her father's name. A sickening jolt of realization hit her like a physical blow. The pressure on the quill was too heavy on the downward strokes. The loop of the T was overly elaborate. It is a forgery, she breathed, the horror sinking deep into her bones. The seal is genuine, but the signature... My uncle forged it. Precisely, Alistair said, leaning back into the shadows. Your father was not financing the assassins who killed my brother. He had discovered who was backing them, and he was murdered to keep him silent. Your uncle Malachi stole your father's signet ring, forged the financial documents, and shifted the blame to a dead man to cover his own treasonous tracks. In doing so, he stole your inheritance, banished you from power, and nearly sold your sister to a monster. Aurelia sat paralyzed, the parchment crinkling under the white-knuckled grip of her fingers. The betrayal was so absolute, so suffocatingly profound, it felt as though the very air had turned to poison. Her uncle had not merely ruined her. He had slaughtered her father and danced on his grave while wearing the robes of a grieving brother. You knew, Aurelia whispered, lifting her gaze to the Northern King. You stood in that council chamber listening to him publicly strip away my title, knowing he was the true traitor. I knew, Alistair confirmed without a trace of apology, but I cannot march a northern army into the southern capital and execute a high lord on a mere suspicion of forgery. The southern kingdom would riot, and we would be plunged into a continent-wide war. I need the original ledger, the master record that Malachi uses to blackmail the other lords involved in the syndicate. He keeps it hidden. Alistair's dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away the roles of king and disgraced maiden, leaving only two people bound by a mutual devastating need for vengeance. I did not buy a bride, Aurelia, Alistair said, his voice a lethal promise. I recruited an accomplice. You know the Southern Court. You know the layout of your uncle's estates and the weaknesses of his allies. Help me tear Malachi Thorne and his syndicate down to the very foundations. Help me avenge my brother's blood. Aurelia looked at the cold, terrifying ruler sitting across from her. He was offering her a path directly through the flames. The marriage contract was no longer a cage. It was a drawn sword placed directly into her hand. Slowly she folded the forged ledger, tucking it securely into the bodice of her velvet dress right next to the hidden silver coin her father had given her. She sat back, the shivering entirely gone from her body, replaced by a cold, elegant fury that matched the frozen landscape outside the window. When I return to the Southern Court, Aurelia said, her voice dropping to a smooth, chilling register that made the Iron Sovereign smile in the dark. I will not just ruin him, Alistair. I'll make him beg for the executioner's block. Ironhold Palace did not welcome its guests. It tested them. Built directly into the jagged, unyielding spine of the northern mountains, the fortress was a staggering monument of dark basalt and fortified iron. As the royal carriage finally passed beneath the massive portcullis, the screaming of the wind was replaced by the echoing synchronized striking of heavy boots against stone. Hundreds of northern guards, stood at absolute rigid attention in the courtyard, their spears catching the pale, bleeding light of the winter sun. There were no gilded statues here, no silk banners fluttering in the breeze, like in the southern capital. Ironhold was a cage of absolute power, completely devoid of mercy. Aurelia stepped out of the carriage onto the frost-slicked cobblestones. Her midnight blue velvet dress stained with the dust of a relentless 3-day journey felt paper-thin against the brutal northern chill, but she refused to tremble. She watched as a cadre of silent, fiercely efficient northern maids swept forward, wrapping her shivering sister Cecily in thick, luxurious furs, and ushering the girl towards the heated, inner chambers of the keep. "The king's physician will tend to her," a voice rumbled from behind. Aurelia turned. King Alistair had already dismounted his massive warhorse, his dark greatcoat sweeping over the frost. He looked entirely in his element, a predator returning to its apex domain. "My steward has prepared a suite for you in the Eastern Tower, Lady Aurelia. You will bathe, you will eat, and you will sleep. We begin our work tomorrow." "I am not tired, Your Grace," Aurelia stated, her voice slicing through the biting air with crystal clarity. "And I do not require a suite to prepare for war. Take me to your council chamber." Alistair paused, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed the ruined southern noblewoman standing before him. Her skin was pale from the cold, her lips bruised purple, yet the fire in her eyes could have melted the ice beneath their feet. He gave a single curt nod. Without another word, he turned on his heel, expecting her to keep pace. The interior of Ironhold was a labyrinth of echoing corridors, lit by massive iron sconces, burning thick beeswax candles. The air smelled of pine resin and old steel. Alistair led her deep into the heart of the palace, pushing open a set of heavy, unadorned oak doors that revealed his private war room. The chamber was dominated by a colossal table carved from a single slab of black weirwood, covered entirely in tactical maps, military deployment ledgers, and intercepted southern missives. Alistair walked to a heavy crystal decanter, poured a dark amber measure of spiced wine, and pushed the silver goblet across the table toward her. "Drink it," he commanded softly. "It will thaw your blood." Aurelia took the goblet but did not drink. Instead, she set it down on the edge of the map, directly over the southern capital. She reached a hand down into the tight, restrictive bodice of her dress, her fingers finding the small secret pockets sewn into the lining. During the journey, Aurelia began, her voice steady and echoing slightly in the vast shadowed room. "You told me you needed the master ledger Malachi uses to blackmail his syndicate. You assume my father was murdered simply because he discovered the forgery." "It is the most logical tactical conclusion," Alistair replied, leaning his knuckles against the black wood, his gaze locked intently on her. "My uncle is a greedy, cowardly man," Aurelia countered, her chin lifting. "But he is not a mastermind. He could never have funded the Crimson Company solely on his own diminished credit. To hire mercenaries to assassinate a northern prince, he needed access to an untraceable, limitless fortune. He needed the crown's deep vault." Alistair's expression instantly hardened. The deep vault was a legendary southern treasury, an ancient reserve of wealth, supposedly sealed a century ago, accessible only by a blood-locked royal seal lost to history. "The vault is a myth, Aurelia. And even if it were real, Malachi Thorne has no royal blood." "No?" Aurelia whispered, a fierce protective pride swelling in her chest. "He does not, but my father did." She pulled her hand from her bodice and placed a heavy, tarnished silver coin onto the black table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. Alistair looked down at the object. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He reached out, picking up the heavy disc. It was not a coin at all. It was an ancient, solid silver matrix etched with the intricate, undeniable crest of the first sovereign, the true forgotten bloodline of the Southern Throne. "My father gave this to me the night before he was killed," Aurelia said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He told me to hide it. He told me that our bloodline was much older and far more dangerous than the Southern Court realized. He was not just the Earl of Thorne, he was the secret keeper of the vault. Malachi didn't just murder my father to cover a forgery, Alistair. He murdered him because he thought my father possessed the seal." Alistair stared at the silver relic in his palm, the flickering candlelight, casting long, sharp shadows across his aristocratic face. The implications crashed through the silent room like a tidal wave. Aurelia Thorne and his corrupt syndicate were currently bleeding the southern economy dry, desperately searching for the one object that would grant them absolute legitimate financial supremacy. They thought they had ruined the Thorne family, casting out a useless niece to clear the board. They had no idea they had just handed the very key to the kingdom directly to the Iron Sovereign. Slowly, Alistair looked up from the seal, his dark, terrifying eyes locking onto Aurelia's. The barrier between them, the wall that separated the cold king and the cast-out bride, shattered completely. He did not see a ruined girl from a disgraced house. He saw a hidden heir standing in his war room with the power to tear the southern continent apart. "He doesn't know you have this," Alistair murmured, his voice laced with a lethal, breathless realization. "He thinks I'm entirely broken," Aurelia replied, her spine straight as a blade. "He thinks I am kneeling in the snow, weeping over my lost title." Alistair stepped around the massive table, closing the distance between them, until the heat of his body radiated against the brutal chill of her clothes. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand gently, almost reverently, taking her trembling fingers and pressing the silver seal firmly back into her palm. "Let him think you are broken, Lady Aurelia," the king whispered, a dark, victorious smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. "Let the traitors feast in their stolen halls, because when we return to the south, you will not be kneeling." The heat in the southern capital was usually a mark of luxury, a golden warmth that bathed the high palace in perpetual careless summer. But tonight inside the private velvet-draped study of Lord Aurelia Thorne, the heat felt like a heavy iron noose tightening around the throats of the kingdom's most powerful traitors. Malachi paced across the imported Myrish carpets, his heavy silk robes dragging behind him like a burden. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of burning beeswax, sweet pipe tobacco, and the sharp, sour tang of nervous sweat. Gathered around his massive mahogany desk were the three men who truly controlled the southern continent. From the shadows, Chancellor Aris, a skeletal man with eyes like polished obsidian, Lord Vance, the master of the royal ports, and Baron Silas, the decaying, brutal lord who had been violently robbed of his bride. "It has been 3 weeks," Silas growled, his thick fingers tapping a frantic, erratic rhythm against the polished wood. He was a monstrously large man, his face flushed with expensive wine and deeply wounded pride. 3 weeks since the Iron Sovereign rode into our court, humiliated us before the nobles, and stole the girl. You assured us she was merely a pawn Malachi, a convenient ruined body to warm his bed, and a political hostage to secure his borders. Malachi stopped pacing, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. "She is a penniless, disgraced orphan. Alistair Vane is a conqueror. He took her to publicly insult me, Silas, nothing more." "Then why is she sitting at his war table?" Chancellor Aris murmured. The question dropped into the opulent room like a lead weight, shattering the fragile illusion of control. The clicking of Silas's fingers stopped instantly. Malachi turned, his blood running suddenly violently cold beneath his thick robes. "What did you say?" Malachi demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Aris reached into the dark folds of his immaculate velvet coat and withdrew a crumpled piece of parchment. It bore the broken black wax seal of a southern spy planted deep within the northern fortress. "My contacts within Ironhold sent this by Raven this morning. The girl was not thrown into the dungeons. She was not locked in a forgotten tower to freeze in her velvet dress. The moment the carriage arrived, the Iron Sovereign took her directly into his private council chamber." Aris let the paper fall onto the desk, his skeletal face pale in the flickering candlelight. "She is reading his tactical maps, Malachi. She is commanding his stewards. It is whispered among the Northern Guard that the king does not treat her as a captive bride. He treats her as a reigning queen." A heavy, terrifying silence suffocated the study. Lord Vance swallowed hard, pulling at the high, restrictive collar of his tunic. His eyes darted nervously to the locked iron safe in the corner of the room. "If she is sitting at his war table, if she has his ear, she could tell him about the forgery." "She knows nothing," Malachi snapped, though his voice completely lacked its usual booming, arrogant authority. His hands were shaking. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. "I forged her father's signature perfectly. I burned the original ledgers to ash. She is a naive child who thinks her father was simply a tragic victim of political circumstance. She has no proof. Is she naive? Silas sneered, standing up and towering over Malachi, his massive frame blocking the heat of the hearth. Because if that girl remembers a single misplaced detail, a single whispered conversation between you and your late brother, the Iron Sovereign will have the excuse he needs to march 100,000 armored Northmen across our borders. He has been looking for a reason to slaughter us ever since his brother died in the neutral territories. You just handed him the key. He needs proof, Malachi hissed, desperate to regain his footing. Alistair Vane is a monster, but he is a deeply calculated one. He will not risk a continent-wide war without absolute undeniable proof of our syndicate's existence. And the only thing that could ever truly destroy us, the only thing that could legitimize his invasion, is the vault. At the mention of the deep vault, the tension in the room shattered into pure visceral panic. The syndicate's entire shadow empire was built on borrowed gold, funneled illegally from the Crown's reserves to pay the Crimson Company mercenaries. They needed the ancient royal seal, the physical matrix of the first sovereign, to legitimize their theft and seize absolute unquestioned control of the throne. Malachi turned and walked swiftly to the iron safe in the corner. He spun the heavy combination dial, his fingers slipping twice from the sweat coating his palms. He wrenched the heavy metal door open and stared blindly into the dark, empty wooden box that had belonged to the late Earl. When I killed my brother, Malachi whispered, staring into the void, his voice trembling. I tore his private study apart. I stripped the rings from his dead fingers. I checked every hidden floorboard and every velvet curtain. The seal of the first sovereign was not there. He turned back to the syndicate, the horrifying realization finally striking him with the force of a swinging blade. The corset of his own arrogance was snapping completely. He remembered the night in the High Court. He remembered Aurelia kneeling on the cold marble. She hadn't been weeping. She hadn't been begging. Her spine had been straight as a blade, and her fingers had been clutched tightly against the bodice of her midnight blue dress. My brother knew I was coming for him, Malachi said, his voice dropping to a terrified, breathless rasp. He knew I wanted the vault. He hid the royal matrix, and he only trusted one person in this entire world with his life. Chancellor Aerys stood up his heavy wooden chair, scraping violently against the floorboards. The girl. If she has the seal, Lord Vance breathed, his face completely devoid of color, leaning heavily against the desk. And she hands it to the Iron Sovereign. He will not just have proof of our treason. He will have the legal divine right to seize the southern economy. He will tear our houses down to the foundation and execute us all in the public square. Malachi's breathing became erratic, his chest heaving under his silk robes. The ruined cast-out bride was no longer a pawn. She was the most dangerous woman in the entire realm. She must not return to the south. Malachi ordered, the panic sharpening into desperate murderous resolve. He grabbed a fresh sheet of parchment and a heavy quill, his hand flying across the paper in a frantic scrawl. Silas sent word to the Crimson Company immediately. Empty the remaining coffers if you must. I want their absolute best assassins on the northern road. Silas's cruel face twisted into a dark, ugly smile. And if she is already secured behind the walls of Ironhold, then they infiltrate the fortress, Malachi hissed, pressing his signet ring violently into a pool of hot red wax. Poison her wine. Cut her throat in the dark. Burn the eastern tower to ashes while she sleeps. I do not care what it costs or how many men you lose. He shoved the sealed order into Silas's massive chest, his eyes wild with the terror of a man watching his stolen kingdom begin to crumble beneath his feet. Aurelia Thorne dies before she ever wears that crown. The relentless northern winter battered the thick basalt walls of Ironhold Palace, the wind howling like a chorus of dying men. It had been 2 weeks since Aurelia arrived in the Winter Kingdom. The bruised cast-out bride who had knelt on the southern marble was gone. Tonight, standing in the king's private solar, she wore a gown of heavy charcoal silk, her corset laced with northern austerity, her spine as straight and uncompromising as the steel blades that lined the armory halls. A roaring fire burned in the massive stone hearth, casting long dancing shadows across the room. King Alistair Vane stood by the heavy oak table, his dark eyes fixed on the silver matrix, the seal of the first sovereign resting between them. "My scholars have scoured the oldest archives of the Northern Library," Alistair said, his deep voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. He was dressed not in his heavy armor, but in a simple black linen tunic that emphasized the sheer predatory power of his frame. "The Deep Vault is not just a treasury, Aurelia. It is the absolute foundation of the southern continent's legitimacy. The legend states that the physical seal is useless without the cipher, and the cipher is locked by a blood ward, a mechanism forged by the ancient Valerian smiths that responds only to the true royal line." Aurelia stepped closer, the heat of the fire warming the chill in her bones. She reached out, her pale fingers hovering over the tarnished silver. "My father never mentioned a blood ward. He only told me to guard it with my life. If Malachi needs the blood of the first sovereign to open the vault, and he possesses none, then he is entirely desperate." Alistair finished, his gaze shifting from the seal to her face. The proximity between them was electric heavy with the unspoken weight of their alliance. "He is sitting on a stolen throne built on crumbling debts. When we ride south, we will not just present this seal. We will force the High Council to recognize that your uncle is a usurper, a fraud who murdered his own brother to chase a ghost he could never catch." Before Aurelia could reply, an unnatural sound sliced through the howling wind outside. It was not the clatter of a guard's boot. It was the faint, sickening scrape asterisk of metal against stone right outside the arched balcony window. Alistair's reaction was terrifyingly instantaneous. The king did not shout. He did not call for the guards. In a blur of lethal speed, he swept his broadsword from the scabbard, resting against the table. "Get behind the hearth," he snarled, his eyes locking onto the heavy velvet curtains. The glass shattered. The heavy balcony doors were violently kicked inward, exploding in a shower of icy shards and splintered wood. The freezing northern storm ripped into the warm room, instantly extinguishing the candles. 4 figures, clad entirely in black leather and crimson masks, slipped through the ruined window, like silent, deadly shadows. The Crimson Company had arrived. Alistair met the first assassin before the man's boots fully hit the floorboards. The Iron Sovereign's blade swung with devastating, brutal force, cleaving through the assassin's collarbone. The man dropped without a sound. But there were 3 left, and they were the most elite killers the Southern Gold could buy. They did not attack the king in a blind rush. They scattered, moving with terrifying precision. One engaged Alistair, keeping the devastating arc of his heavy sword occupied, while the other 2 immediately bypassed the king, their eyes locking on to the heavy silver seal on the table and the woman standing beside it. "Aurelia, move!" Alistair roared, burying his blade into his attacker's chest and ripping it free in a spray of blood. Aurelia did not scream. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her in the southern court had been burned away the moment she realized her uncle was a murderer. As the closest assassin lunged at her, a jagged poisoned dagger glinting in the firelight, she grabbed the heavy crystal wine decanter from the table and smashed it directly across the man's masked face. The assassin stumbled, blinded by the alcohol and shattered crystal, but his blade flailed wildly as he fell. The razor-sharp edge caught Aurelia's forearm, slicing cleanly through the thick charcoal silk and biting deeply into her flesh. She gasped, stumbling backward of her hand, instinctively flying to the wound. Blood hot and shockingly bright spilled over her fingers. She fell against the oak table, her bleeding hand slamming heavily directly onto the silver matrix. The third assassin vaulted over the table, his dagger raised for the killing blow. He never made it. Alistair moved with a terrifying primal fury. He grabbed the assassin by the throat with his bare, leather-gloved hand, lifting the man entirely off his feet. With a sickening asterisk crack asterisk that echoed over the roaring wind, the king snapped the man's neck and threw his lifeless body into the shadows. Silence descended violently upon the ruined solar. The wind howled through the broken glass, tossing the velvet curtains into the air. Alistair was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his sword dripping with fresh blood. He spun around, his dark, panicked eyes searching the room until they locked onto Aurelia. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, closing the distance between them in 2 massive strides. "I am fine," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she clutched her bleeding arm. "It is just a cut." Alistair reached for her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he inspected the wound. But as he pulled her hand away from the table, a strange metallic clicking sound froze them both. They looked down at the table. Aurelia's blood had completely coated the ancient silver matrix, but the blood was not simply pooling on the surface. It was being absorbed into the microscopic grooves of the metal. The seal was physically shifting. The solid block of silver suddenly fractured along unseen seams, blooming outward like a mechanical lotus flower. Intricate, impossibly complex gears whirred into motion, unlocking a heavy, layered cylinder that rose from the center of the coin. A map of the deep vault's location etched in glowing blood-red Valerian steel projected faintly from the intricate cipher. Aurelia stared at it, the breath leaving her lungs completely. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a terrifying realization washing over her. The mechanism only answered to one thing. Alistair slowly looked up from the transformed bleeding seal to Aurelia's pale face. The brutal cold demeanor of the Winter King completely shattered, replaced by an expression of absolute profound shock. The Blood-Ward, Alistair whispered, his voice incredibly quiet in the ruined room. The seal does not open for the Keeper. Aurelia looked at her trembling, blood-stained hands. It opens for the Heir, she breathed. The magnitude of the truth crashed into the room, rearranging the very fabric of their reality. Her father had not simply been guarding the royal wealth. He had been guarding her. The Thorne family were not mere noblemen. They were the hidden direct descendants of the first sovereign. The entire southern dynasty currently sitting on the throne were pretenders. Alistair stepped back, his dark eyes locked onto her, seeing her not as a cast-out bride, not even as an accomplice, but as the living, breathing embodiment of the Southern Crown. The stakes had just multiplied infinitely. He wasn't just marching south to avenge his brother and execute Malachi. You are not just a noble woman who lost her title, Aurelia, Alistair said, his voice dropping to a fierce, reverent vow that sent a shiver down her spine. The monster of the north slowly went down on one knee amidst the shattered glass, and the blood of assassins bowing his head to the ruined girl. You are the true queen of the realm, and I am going to tear down the entire southern continent to put you back on your throne. The storm continued to hurl jagged ice against the thick basalt walls of Ironhold Palace, but inside the king's private apothecary chamber, the silence was absolute, heavy, and deeply intimate. The bodies of the Crimson Company assassins had been dragged away by the silent Northern Guard, leaving only the sharp scent of iron blood and the budding astringent of crushed medicinal herbs in the air. Aurelia sat on the edge of a heavy oak table, her ruined charcoal silk gown pushed back to expose her injured forearm. She did not wince, nor did she look away as King Alistair Vane meticulously cleaned the deep, jagged cut. He had discarded his heavy greatcoat and removed his leather gauntlets. His bare hands, calloused from a lifetime of wielding heavy broadswords and ruling a brutal, frozen kingdom, were shockingly gentle against her pale skin. Between them, on a silver tray, rested the ancient Valerian matrix, its complex blooming gears finally still yet radiating a terrible, undeniable truth. My father knew, Aurelia whispered into the quiet room, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic storm of grief and revelation warring in her chest. All those years living as a disgraced, marginalized branch of the southern nobility, he subjected himself to the mockery of the High Court. He let them call him a fool, a weakling, a man addicted to old books and forgotten ledgers. He did it all to keep the crown's true bloodline hidden in plain sight. Alistair paused his work. He picked up a strip of clean white linen and began to tightly bind her wound. A king hiding his heir from a court full of starving wolves, he murmured, his dark eyes lifting to meet hers. He knew that if the Syndicate ever discovered the blood of the first sovereign still flowed through your veins, they would not have merely stripped your titles. They would have slaughtered you in your crib to ensure their stolen power remained absolute. Aurelia's fingers curled into a tight fist against her lap. The corset encasing her ribs felt less like a prison now, and more like armor. The horrific public humiliation she had endured in the High Council chamber, the sneers of the nobles, the violent tearing of her family crest from her neck, the threat of being sold to Baron Silas, it had all been a blind, ignorant farce. They had forced the true queen of the realm to kneel on the cold marble, completely unaware that she held the absolute divine right to execute every single one of them. Malachi sent his best killers tonight, Aurelia said, her eyes narrowing with a cold, lethal clarity. He is panicking. He realizes the physical matrix is missing, and he assumes I stole it to secure my place in your bed. He still does not know what I truly am. Alistair finished tying the linen bandage, his large hands lingering for a fraction of a second against her wrist, feeling the strong, steady pulse of her royal blood. And that ignorance, Aurelia, is the greatest weapon we possess. He stepped back, crossing his arms over his chest, the strategist instantly replacing the protector. If I march my northern legions across the border tomorrow, it will be viewed as an unprovoked foreign invasion. The southern lords, even those who despise your uncle, will rally behind him to protect their lands. The realm will burn for a decade. Alistair walked towards the heavy iron hearth, staring into the roaring flames. But if I cross the border, not as a conqueror, but as the vanguard of the true queen, if we present the Blood-Ward Matrix to the High Court and expose Malachi Thorne not just as a murderer, but as a usurper of the divine bloodline, the Southern Army will not fight us. They will bow. They will not believe a piece of silver simply because we place it on a table, Aurelia countered, stepping down from the oak surface. She moved toward him, the pain in her arm entirely eclipsed by the burning need for justice. Malachi controls the narrative. He controls Chancellor Aris and the High Council. We cannot just declare the truth from the borderlands. We must tear his power from his hands in front of the very people who uphold it. Alistair turned a dark, incredibly dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. The Grand Solstice Banquet is in exactly 12 days. Aurelia's breath hitched. The Solstice Banquet was the pinnacle of the Southern Court's calendar. It was a massive opulent display of wealth and power held in the great glass hall of the capital. Every High Lord, foreign dignitary, military general and council member would be in attendance. It was where alliances were forged, and the kingdom's absolute hierarchy was publicly displayed. Malachi will be sitting on the southern throne. Aurelia realized the strategic brilliance of the timing crystallizing in her mind. He will be attempting to solidify his rule to prove to the realm that his syndicate is untouchable. And while he is drinking stolen wine and wearing a stolen crown, Alistair said, his voice a low, echoing rumble of pure vengeance, we will walk through the front doors. He closed the distance between them, his presence an overwhelming force of nature. He did not look at her with the pity of a savior, nor the transactional coldness he had shown in the carriage. He looked at her as an absolute equal. We will not sneak in like thieves, Aurelia. Alistair vowed, his dark eyes burning with an intense, fierce devotion that made her heart race. We will not wage a shadow war in the alleys of this capital. I'm going to dress you in the finest silk and the heaviest diamonds the Winter Kingdom possesses. I'm going to march my elites, royal guards, straight into his banquet hall, and we are going to publicly execute his authority before the entire world. Aurelia looked up at the terrifying, magnificent monster of the north. Her uncle had stripped her of her name and cast her out to die. He had stolen her father's life and sold her sister's future. But standing in the cold stone of Ironhold, armed with the blood of kings, and the devotion of the realm's most dangerous ruler, she knew Malachi's reign was already over. She reached out her uninjured hand, resting flat against Alistair's chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. 12 days, Alistair. Aurelia whispered, her voice carrying the absolute unyielding weight of the crown she was born to wear. Let them prepare their feasts. Let them wear their finest velvets, because when I return to the Southern Court, I am not just taking my family's honor back. Her spine straightened her chin, lifting with terrifying elegant grace. I am taking the entire kingdom. The great glass hall of the southern capital was a staggering monument to absolute unbridled excess. Built entirely of white marble and massive panes of imported crystal, the hall was designed to catch the light of 1,000 beeswax candles, dripping from golden chandeliers, creating an illusion of perpetual blinding daylight. The air inside the cavernous room was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the scent of roasted venison-spiced honey wine, and the overpowering sweet rose perfumes favored by the southern nobility. It was the night of the Grand Solstice Banquet, the most vital political event of the year, where power was flaunted, alliances were bought, and the weak were quietly erased from the ledgers of history. At the highest point of the hall, seated on a raised dais just one step below the empty royal throne, sat Lord Malachi Thorne. He wore a doublet of deep crimson velvet embroidered with heavy gold thread, looking every inch the absolute ruler he believed himself to be. The panic that had consumed him 2 weeks prior, in his dark study, had been entirely replaced by a gluttonous, arrogant confidence. The Crimson Company had sent a coded raven 3 days ago, confirming their successful infiltration of Ironhold Palace. As far as Malachi and his syndicate knew, the terrifying Northern King was currently mourning a murdered bride, and the last remaining heir of the Thorne family, the only living threat to the Deep Vault, was a frozen corpse in the mountains. Malachi raised his heavy golden goblet, calling for silence. The lively string quartet abruptly stopped playing, and the rustling silk skirts of the hundreds of lords and ladies stilled as they turned their attention to the dais. "My esteemed lords, ladies, and honoured guests," Malachi boomed, his voice echoing off the glass walls, dripping with practiced benevolence. "We gather tonight not only to celebrate the turning of the season, but the turning of our great kingdom's fortunes. For too long, the shadow of treason hung over our court. The late Earl of Thorne, my own blood, sought to bankrupt our lands and fund our enemies." He paused, letting a murmur of engineered outrage ripple through the crowd. Chancellor Aris and Lord Silas, seated at the high table beside him, offered grim, approving nods. "But we have excised that rot," Malachi continued, his chest puffing out. "We have banished the stains of his legacy, and in doing so, we have secured a future of unmatched prosperity and absolute peace. The Southern Throne stands strong." The court erupted into polite sycophantic applause. Lords raised their glasses to the man they believed was mere days away from officially declaring himself Lord Regent. Malachi smiled, lifting his wine to his lips to drink in his absolute victory. Then the atmosphere in the great glass hall shattered completely. It did not happen slowly. It was a visceral, violent shift that made the corset of every noble woman in the room suddenly feel too tight. The massive 20-foot-high doors of solid oak and brass at the far end of the banquet hall did not merely open. They were violently kicked apart with a force that sheared the heavy iron deadbolts completely off their hinges. The echoing asterisk crack asterisk sounded like a cannon shot in the confined space. Malachi flinched, his golden goblet slipping a fraction of an inch in his grip. The polite applause of the court died instantly in their throats. The terrified Southern Palace guards, stationed at the entrance, were shoved violently aside, disarmed, and thrown to the marble floor by a vanguard of towering men clad in heavy steel armor and black wolf fur. The freezing razor-sharp wind of the northern winter blasted into the stifling perfumed heat of the banquet hall. Through the parted sea of northern soldiers, King Alistair Vane, the Iron Sovereign, stepped into the light. He did not wear the ceremonial silks expected of a visiting monarch at a solstice feast. He wore his battle uniform, dark, impeccably tailored leathers, an armor gorget of blackened steel, and his heavy broadsword strapped openly to his hip. He looked like an apex predator walking into a cage of terrified, brightly colored birds. The crowd of nobles instantly scrambled backward, parting desperately to clear a wide path down the center of the hall. But it was not the terrifying presence of the Northern King that made the collective breath of the entire kingdom completely stop. It was the woman walking flawlessly beside him. Lady Aurelia Thorne had returned. She did not look like the ruined weeping girl they had publicly humiliated on this very marble just weeks ago. She did not look like a cast-out orphan or a desperate political hostage. She looked like a goddess of war descending to execute judgment. Aurelia wore a gown of stark, blinding white silk that swept silently over the marble, overlaid with a structural corset of dark northern steel that cinched her waist tightly. A heavy cape of midnight, black velvet, lined with silver fox fur, spilled from her shoulders, pooling behind her like a shadow. But it was her demeanor that was truly lethal. Her spine was perfectly straight, her chin elevated with an elegant, terrifying arrogance. The pale skin of her face was completely devoid of emotion, and her dark eyes were fixed with absolute laser precision on the dais at the end of the hall. To the absolute horror of the Southern Court, the Iron Sovereign did not walk ahead of her. He walked perfectly at her side, his large, leather-gloved hand resting lightly but possessively at the small of her back. He was not leading a captive. He was escorting a queen. The silence in the hall was deafening. The only sound was the synchronized, rhythmic clicking of Aurelia's heels against the floorboards and the heavy thud of Alistair's boots. On the dais, Malachi Thorne stopped breathing entirely. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. The heavy golden goblet slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the marble table with a loud clatter, and spilling dark red wine across the white tablecloth like fresh blood. Beside him, Lord Silas pushed his chair back so violently it tipped over with a crash, his eyes wide with stark, unadulterated terror. They had sent their best assassins. They had paid a fortune in stolen gold. Yet here she was, not just alive but radiating an untouchable royal power that eclipsed every lord in the room. Aurelia and Alistair reached the base of the dais. They did not bow. They did not offer the customary Solstice greetings. The silence stretched, sharpening Aurelia's absolute fury into an elegant, suffocating blade. She looked up at the trembling man, sitting one step away from the throne, her gaze stripping away his velvet and gold, until nothing remained but a cornered, cowardly murderer. "You look entirely surprised to see me, uncle," Aurelia said. Her voice was not a shout, but it carried perfectly through the dead silence of the cavernous hall, cold and sharp as shattering ice. "But then again, you always did underestimate the resilience of true blood." The heavy drops of spilled red wine pattered against the marble floor of the dais, sounding like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of Lord Malachi's stolen reign. For a moment, the southern nobles were entirely paralyzed, trapped between the absolute terror of the northern army that had just breached their sacred hall and the impossible ghostly return of the ruined Thorne heiress. Malachi's throat worked frantically. He looked at Aurelia, then at the towering, lethal form of the Iron Sovereign standing right beside her. The Syndicate's assassins had failed. His absolute nightmare had walked right through the front doors. But the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable died hard. "Guards!" Malachi shrieked, his voice cracking violently, completely devoid of its usual booming authority. "Seize them! Arrest the girl! She is a banished traitor to the crown! How dare you interrupt the royal solstice feast!" A dozen southern royal guards stepped forward hesitantly, their halberds shaking in their hands. King Alistair did not draw his broadsword. He did not even raise his voice. He merely shifted his stance, resting his leather-gloved hand casually upon the heavy steel pommel of his weapon. "The first man who takes a step toward my queen," Alistair rumbled, his dark voice carrying effortlessly across the cavernous room, "will find his head separated from his shoulders before his foot touches the marble. And then I will order my cavalry to butcher every lord in this room." The southern guards froze instantly. The sheer predatory promise in the Iron Sovereign's eyes was absolute. No one moved. The nobles in the front rows instinctively shrank back, pressing themselves against the glass walls of the banquet hall. Aurelia stepped forward, leaving Alistair at her side. She ascended the first step of the dais, her white silk skirts and heavy black velvet cape sweeping elegantly over the stone. She did not look at the guards. Her burning dark eyes were fixed entirely on her uncle. "A traitor to the crown!" Aurelia repeated the words, rolling off her tongue with a cold, terrifying grace. She reached into the folds of her cape and withdrew a folded piece of parchment. She held it up the light of 1,000 chandeliers illuminating the heavy wax seal of House Thorne. "Is this the treason you speak of?" "Uncle, the financial ledger you presented to the High Court. The one that supposedly proved my father was funding the Crimson Company." Chancellor Oris, sitting pale and rigid at the high table, attempted to salvage the Syndicate's crumbling facade. "Lady Aurelia, you are entirely out of order. That document was verified by the Council. The Earl's signature is upon it." "It is a flawless forgery, Chancellor," Aurelia replied sharply, her gaze snapping to the skeletal man. "Executed by my uncle to cover his own monumental debts. He murdered. My father stole his signet ring and framed a dead man to seize the Thorne estates." A collective horrified gasp echoed through the great glass hall. To accuse a sitting Lord Regent of fratricide in the middle of the Solstice banquet was an act of absolute political destruction. "Lies," Malachi spat, gripping the edges of the high table, his knuckles bone white. Sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his immaculate grooming. "You have no proof. You are a desperate, ruined girl, clinging to the coattails of a foreign warmonger. The word of an exiled orphan means absolutely nothing in this court." "You are entirely correct, Malachi," Aurelia said softly, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow forced the entire room to lean in. The word of an orphan means nothing. But my father did not die over a forged ledger. He died because you were desperate to find something he possessed. Something you needed to legitimize your illegitimate crumbling syndicate. Lord Silas, the decaying baron who was supposed to marry her, let out a choked, panicked sound and scrambled backward, crashing into a pillar. He knew exactly what she was about to reveal. You tore his study apart, Aurelia continued, ascending the second step of the dais, her presence now towering over the seated lords. You stripped the rings from his dead fingers. You searched the ashes, but you never found it, because he had already given it to me. Malachi's breath stopped. His eyes widened into sources of pure, unfiltered dread. He raised a trembling hand as if he could physically stop the words from leaving her lips. Do not. He begged, a pathetic, whispered plea that was swallowed by the silence of the hall. Aurelia reached beneath the steel corset binding her waist. Her pale fingers emerged holding a heavy, tarnished silver disc. She did not toss it onto the table. She held it up high, letting the brilliant, blinding light of the Solstice candles catch the intricate, undeniably ancient crest etched into the metal. The intertwining dragons of the Valerian smiths. The crest of the first sovereign. The deep vault is not a myth, Aurelia declared, her voice ringing out with the absolute unyielding authority of a true monarch. And this is its key. The southern court erupted into chaos. Lords and ladies cried out in shock, falling to their knees, pointing at the legendary relic. The Matrix was considered wholly a divine artifact lost to time, the absolute symbol of right to rule. She stole it! Malachi screamed, completely losing his mind. He lunged across the table, his heavy gold chain swinging wildly. It is a fake trick forged by northern smiths. If it is a fake, uncle, Aurelia said, her eyes narrowing with a brutal, elegant vengeance, then why did you empty the remaining royal coffers to hire the Crimson Company to kill me for it? 4 of your elite assassins broke into Ironhold Palace 12 nights ago. They failed. She slowly pushed the sleeve of her stark white gown back, revealing the thick white linen bandage wrapped tightly around her forearm. She deliberately unwound the linen, letting it fall to the floor, exposing the angry red scar left by the assassin's poisoned blade. But they did manage to draw my blood, Aurelia whispered. She pressed her scarred forearm against the silver matrix in her hand. The nobles closest to the dais gasped as the ancient relic reacted. The silver mechanisms, dormant for a century, recognized the residual royal bloodline pulsating beneath her skin. The seal visibly shifted in her hand, tiny gears clicking audibly in the dead silence of the hall, glowing with a faint, terrifying red light. The matrix does not open for a thief, Aurelia proclaimed, her voice echoing with the devastating weight of 100 years of hidden history. And it does not open for a forged signature. It opens only for the blood of the first sovereign. She looked down at Malachi, who had collapsed back into his chair, a broken, defeated shell of a man. You thought you were ruining a useless niece, Aurelia said, the absolute elegant power reversal complete. You were simply holding the throne warm for the true queen. The faint, terrifying red light of the Valerian matrix bled across the terrified faces of the southern nobility, casting long, damning shadows against the crystal walls of the great glass hall. For a century, the bloodline of the first sovereign had been considered nothing more than a myth, a ghost story whispered by old men mourning the ancient days of absolute royal glory. Yet here it was physically pulsating in the palm of the ruined girl. They had openly mocked her royal blood, activating the intricate, mechanical heart of the kingdom's deepest secret. The absolute magnitude of the revelation paralyzed the room. The lords and ladies who had spent their entire lives maneuvering through the treacherous political currents of the court suddenly realized they had been swimming in a puddle, blindly pledging their loyalty to a syndicate of lowly thieves. Lord Silas was the first to break. The massive, decaying baron realized with horrific clarity that the gold paying his debts was stolen, and the woman he had intended to drag to his borderland estate was his divine monarch. He let out a breathless, animalistic sound of pure terror, turned on the heel of his heavy leather boots, and sprinted toward the side arches of the hall, desperately seeking the servants' corridors. He did not make it 3 steps. King Alistair did not even have to issue a verbal command. 2 towering commanders of the Winter Guard stepped effortlessly into Silas's path. The heavy wooden shaft of a northern halberd swept precisely at knee level, shattering the Baron's legs. Silas crashed face first onto the unforgiving marble with a sickening thud, his nose breaking on impact, bleeding out onto the pristine floor he had sought to rule. Chancellor Aris, the skeletal mastermind of the Syndicate's political facade, scrambled out of his chair at the high table. His obsidian eyes darted frantically, searching for a legal loophole, a sympathetic lord, a path to survival. Lady Aurelia, Aris gasped, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, completely abandoning Malachi. I was deceived. The council was deceived. Lord Malachi presented us with forged documents. We had no knowledge of his fratricide or your divine lineage. We merely sought to protect the realm's economy. Aurelia turned her dark, burning eyes toward the Chancellor. The heavy steel corset around her ribs held her posture in flawless, unyielding perfection. She did not raise her voice, but the sheer glacial contempt in her tone cut through the hall like a physical blade. You are a liar, Chancellor Aris? Aurelia stated, her voice echoing into the absolute silence. You did not protect the economy. You laundered it. You funneled stolen royal gold through my late father's holding companies to fund the Crimson Company assassins. I have the true ledgers recovered from my uncle's private safe. Your signature is written in blood right next to his. Aris's mouth opened and closed silently, his skeletal face turning the color of old parchment. He collapsed back against the heavy oak table, the remaining threads of his power entirely severed. Aurelia finally turned her full, devastating attention back to the man sitting in the center of the dais. Lord Malachi Thorne, the man who had ordered her father's death, stolen her title, and forced her to her knees in public disgrace, was completely broken. His expensive crimson velvet doublet looked suddenly absurd, a child's costume, worn by a crumbling, pathetic old man. He slid slowly from the high chair, his knees hitting the marble floor with a heavy, hollow sound. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate weeping terror of a man looking directly at the executioner's block. Aurelia, please, Malachi whimpered, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the hem of her stark, white silk gown. I am your uncle. I am your blood. I was protecting our house. The power, it blinded me. Please, I beg you, have mercy on an old man. Aurelia did not step back. She stood over him, a goddess of vengeance sculpted from frost and absolute dignity. The chandeliers above caught the flash of the silver matrix still glowing in her hand. You invoked my father's name to steal his kingdom. You invoked our house to sell my sister? Aurelia whispered, her voice devoid of even a singular drop of mercy. You stood in the High Council and publicly stripped me of everything I possessed, forcing me to kneel before a false throne. You showed no mercy to the innocent. You will find absolutely none from the crown. She lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over the silent, terrified court, before returning to the shattered usurper at her feet. Malachi Thorne, Aurelia declared, her voice ringing out with the absolute terrifying weight of royal justice. I strip you of your titles. I strip you of your lands, your stolen wealth, and your name. You are hereby arrested for high treason, fratricide, and the attempted assassination of a reigning sovereign. You will be taken to the deepest dungeon of the capital, where you will await public execution. At her exact word, the northern cavalrymen moved with brutal, synchronized efficiency. They hauled the weeping, thrashing Malachi off the floor, binding his wrists in heavy iron chains. They dragged Chancellor Aris from behind the table and hauled the bleeding Lord Silas to his feet. The clatter of chains echoed through the great glass hall, a violently beautiful sound of a corrupt regime being entirely dismantled in minutes. As the traitors were dragged away, their frantic pleas fading down the long corridors, a heavy, suffocating tension descended upon the remaining southern nobles. They stood frozen, breathing shallowly, realizing they were completely at the mercy of the woman they had cast out heavily, backed by the terrifying northern king, who stood silently at her side, his hand resting on his sword. General Varian, the oldest and most decorated military commander of the southern forces, stepped forward from the crowd. He was a man of immense pride, a veteran of countless border wars. He looked at the glowing Valerian matrix, then looked up into the fierce, unyielding eyes of Lady Aurelia Thorne. Slowly, deliberately, the old general unclasped his sword belt, letting his weapon clatter loudly against the marble. he lowered his armored frame, his knee striking the stone floor with a heavy, resonating thud. He bowed his head low, exposing his neck in absolute submission. To the first blood, General Varian rumbled, his voice thick with raw emotion. To the true queen of the realm. The general's action broke the dam of absolute terror and realization. Like a collapsing wave, the sheer weight of history and power forced the entire court down. Silk skirts rustled violently against cold marble. Echoing thuds filled the cavernous room as arrogant dukes whispering countesses, and corrupt ministers dropped to their knees one by one, bowing their heads, until the entire great glass hall was a sea of absolute submission. Aurelia stood perfectly still amidst the hundreds of kneeling nobles. Her breathing steadied. The agonizing pain of her banishment dissolved into the glorious, undeniable reality of her restoration. She felt a warmth at her side. King Alistair Vane looked down at the silent, bowing kingdom, then turned his dark, fierce eyes to her. The Iron Sovereign did not smile, but the look of absolute consuming pride and devotion on his face was far more devastating than any weapon he possessed. He stepped back, leaving her entirely in the center of the light, allowing the realm to worship the only ruler who truly mattered. Exactly 1 month later, the execution block in the central plaza of the southern capital had been washed completely clean of Malachi Thorne's blood, but the profound tectonic shift within the kingdom remained absolute. The heavy iron doors of the deep vault, sealed for over a century, had finally been opened by the blood of the true heir. The sheer magnitude of the ancient wealth hidden beneath the palace had not only instantly erased the crown's crippling debts, but had permanently secured the prosperity of the realm for generations to come. The corrupt syndicate was entirely eradicated, their lands seized, their names struck from the noble ledgers. Justice cold and uncompromising had swept through the court like a cleansing northern blizzard. Now the heavy ancient oak doors of the cathedral of the First Sovereign stood open. Inside the private antechamber of the cathedral, the air was thick with the scent of burning myrrh, frankincense, and the faint crisp lingering of winter pine. Lady Aurelia Thorne stood before a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror of polished silver. Her 16-year-old sister Cecily, her cheeks flushed with healthy color, and her eyes no longer clouded by the shadow of fear, carefully adjusted the heavy velvet train of Aurelia's magnificent gown. The dress was a flawless masterpiece of absolute royal authority. It was constructed of deep blood-red silk, the ancient color of the First Sovereign, woven with intricate threads of pure Valarian gold. It was draped over a rigid, protective corset of dark northern steel that held her spine perfectly straight. The long sweeping edges of the cape were trimmed in the thick black wolf fur of the Winter Kingdom, a permanent visible testament to the undeniable union between the Southern Throne and the Iron Sovereign. The heavy latch of the antechamber door clicked. The rustling of the waiting maids ceased instantly as they bowed their heads and quietly slipped out of the room, leaving Aurelia and Cecily with the king. Alistair Vane stepped into the warm light of the chamber. He wore his formal royal regalia, a beautifully tailored tunic of midnight black velvet lined with silver. His heavy broadsword resting at his hip, a dark crown of forged iron resting upon his dark hair. He looked magnificent, a terrifying conqueror who had entirely brought the southern continent to its knees without waging a single battle. Cecily offered him a deep, respectful curtsy before quietly exiting the room, leaving the king and the soon-to-be queen entirely alone. Alistair walked slowly across the stone floor, his dark eyes sweeping over Aurelia's reflection in the silver mirror. The cold, brutal mask of the Mayfair monster was completely gone, replaced by a look of absolute consuming devotion. He stopped directly behind her, his broad shoulders framing her perfectly in the glass. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently resting upon her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone just above the steel corset. "You look entirely terrifying, my queen," Alistair murmured, his low baritone voice vibrating against her skin. "The court will not just bow to you today, they will tremble." Aurelia leaned back slightly into his solid warmth, the ghost of her banishment completely fading into the past. She looked at his reflection, remembering the arrogant, fearsome king who had stepped into her uncle's high court and offered her a cold, transactional cage to save her life. "Do you remember the night you claimed me?" Aurelia whispered, a soft, genuine smile touching her lips. I stood on the marble, stripped of my family name, and told you that you disgusted me." Alistair let out a low, dark chuckle, his chest rumbling against her back. "I remember every single syllable. It was the exact moment I realized I had not merely found a political pawn. I had found the only woman in the world with a spirit fierce enough to match my own." He lowered his head, pressing a soft, reverent kiss to the curve of her neck. "You did not want a master, Aurelia, and I did not want a captive. I wanted an equal to rule the world with." Aurelia turned in his arms, facing the most dangerous man in the realm. She reached up her hands, resting flat against the fine velvet of his chest. "You gave me the power to take my kingdom back, Alistair. You marched your army into the Viper's Nest to ensure my survival. I am the true heir of the South, yes, but this crown, this victory, it belongs to both of us." "Then let us go claim it," Alistair vowed softly, his eyes burning with an unbreakable promise. The massive bronze bells of the cathedral began to toll a deep resonating thunder that shook the ancient stone foundation. It was time. Alistair offered her his arm. Aurelia took it, her posture flawlessly regal, her heart beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. Together they walked out of the antechamber and into the blinding light of the colossal nave. The cathedral was packed with thousands of nobles, knights, and dignitaries. The elite Winter Guard stood shoulder to shoulder with the Southern Royal Knights, a visual representation of an unbreakable alliance. As Aurelia and Alistair stepped onto the central aisle, the entire congregation fell into an absolute breathless silence. The only sound was the sweeping of her heavy silk skirts over the cold marble and the synchronized, echoing footsteps of the two most powerful monarchs in the world. At the end of the aisle, standing atop the grand marble dais before the golden altar, the High Archbishop waited. In his trembling ancient hands, he held a velvet cushion. Resting upon it was the legendary crown of the first sovereign, a breathtaking wreath forged from unbreakable Valerian steel, set with massive blood-red rubies, and diamonds that caught the light like frozen stars. It had not been worn in over 100 years. Aurelia stopped at the base of the dais. She slowly released Alistair's arm and ascended the steps alone. She did not kneel in disgrace as she had in her uncle's court. She knelt with absolute divine grace on the velvet cushion before the altar. The Archbishop raised his hands, his voice carrying over the silent, echoing cathedral. "By the divine right of blood, by the unyielding scales of justice, and by the ancient laws of the realm," the Archbishop proclaimed, "we return the stolen throne to its rightful keeper." He lifted the heavy Valerian crown. Aurelia held her breath, her spine straight as a blade. The cold metal descended, resting perfectly heavily upon her dark hair. The sheer physical weight of it was grounding the weight of her father's sacrifice, the weight of her suffering, and the ultimate glorious weight of her absolute victory. "Arise, Aurelia of House Thorne," the Archbishop declared, "first of her blood, the Winter Queen, the true sovereign of the realm." Aurelia rose to her feet. She turned slowly to face the massive congregation. The crown flashed violently beneath the light of the stained glass. She looked out over the sea of faces. The lords who had once mocked her, the ladies who had whispered cruelties, and the northern warriors who had bled for her. None of them were whispering now. In perfect staggering unison, thousands of people descended to their knees. Silk-rustled armor clanked, and swords were laid flat against the stone floor. The entire kingdom bowed, not in the panicked terror they had shown Malachi, but in profound, absolute reverence. Aurelia looked to her right. King Alistair Vane stood at the edge of the dais. The Iron Sovereign, the man who bowed to absolutely no one, lowered his head in a deep, respectful nod to his queen, a dark, victorious smile playing on his lips. The cast-out bride had not merely returned, she had conquered. And as Aurelia stood before the kneeling world, the heavy crown resting upon her head, and the realm's most feared ruler standing by her side, she knew her reign would be glorious, unbreakable, and absolute.